Stanley Kubrick, An Astrological Portrait by Ciro Discepolo. The scorpionic Plutonian marking in Stanley Kubrick is quite evident, and marks in a transversal sense not only his entire filmography, but also his life as a man. He began as a freelance photographer on the streets of the Big Apple. One day, upon the death of President Roosevelt, he had a peculiar idea. He thought of staging a photograph. He asked a newsstand owner to help him, and did the same with some passers-by. The newsstand was plastered with front pages of newspapers featuring the photo of the deceased president and 9-column headlines announcing it. He asked some passers-by to pose with a sad and dramatic air in front of those photos and asked the newsstand owner to also assume an ear in tune with the event. He took the photo and brought it to the New York Times, which bought it, if I'm not mistaken, for $10. From there began his career as a journalist-director and finally as a director. Pluto is dominant at the medium Coeli, and the moon is in Scorpio, which can be read through many of his works, as we will see shortly. He was a Leo in the true sense of the word and not a compensated Leo. He needed money to film his first movie, Paths of Glory, an extraordinary anti-militarist film that I still watch and rewatch many times today. He decided to turn to an uncle, also Jewish, in Los Angeles and went to California to ask him for a loan. The uncle agreed, but asked for the addition of a clause to the contract by which he would become the owner of half of all the future cinematic earnings of the young man whose talent he had sensed. Kubrick, nauseated by this attitude, left, but was reached at the airport by the relative and won the day. Another episode that certainly speaks to his being a Leo in the true sense was the one that saw him as the protagonist of an equally tough tug-of-war during the production of his second film, Spartacus. The producer and leading actor of the film was Kirk Douglas, who had chosen Kubrick thinking he could dominate him and be the true director of the feature film. However, he had miscalculated badly, given the remarkable strength of this scorpionic Leo, though this is a hypothesis, as the birth time is not certain, and a tenacious Mars in Taurus. First, the young director asked the director of photography to create an artificial sunset for him to frame the scene of the defeat of the rebel gladiator crushed by the invincible Roman army. Although set in Italy, the film was shot for economy in Hollywood studios. Kubrick filmed that scene with hundreds of extras in deadly poses and covered in blood, whose red color was meant to recall the same tone of our main star. At the sunset of a day of war and death, reviewing the film scene, the subject harshly addressed the photography technician. "And this is supposed to be a sunset, in your opinion?" The other, infuriated, threatened to resign, but Kubrick ordered him to sit and let him take over from that moment on. The result was that the technician won the Oscar for Best Photography. Kubrick was not only one of the greatest film directors in the history of cinema, perhaps truly the greatest, in perfect harmony with the sign that effectively produces born directors like Alfred Hitchcock, Strehler, Eduardo De Filippo, Sun in The Fifth House, and many others, but also a strategist who even applied military-type strategies as a good Plutonian Scorpio to his plans. When he left the offices of a very important American major with a contract in his pocket for the most expensive film in the history of cinema, 2001: A Space Odyssey, he confessed to a friend, "If these gentlemen had suspected for even a moment that they were financing a religious film, they would never have signed the deal." and indeed the film was strongly so, even if many never noticed. The stele, the black monolith that accompanies the entire history of humanity, from its ape-like evolution passing through the era of interplanetary travel and up to the metaphysics of the newborn pure immaterial essence floating in infinite space. Strategy in Kubrick was everything. After the economic bloodletting suffered by American film companies for his space colossal, he thought of tightening the budget enormously and filmed A Clockwork Orange, another great masterpiece, but with a relatively small cost and then filmed mostly in London studios. In this film we read with absolute transparency the fundamental themes related to the Scorpio-Pluto values of Stanley Kubrick's natal chart: sex, lots of sex, violence, criminality, and death. We find more sex, but told in a decidedly erotic key, and not spectacularized as in the previous masterpiece. In his Lolita, from Nabokov's novel, one might say, a masterpiece without comparison, but is there, in your opinion, at least one of his films that is not such? Probably the Saturn in the second house that we see in his natal chart was actually there because throughout his life he had to deal with money and budget problems, more in relation to the films he was planning and shooting than in relation to his own personal finances. This ended up sharpening his ingenuity and making him search for and often find solutions up to the situations. Those who love the cinema of this great master know the skillful and at times incredible use he made of tracking shots, as in the case of the camera closely following the child protagonist riding his tricycle through the terrifying corridors of the Overlook Hotel in The Shining. Well, since the film Paths of Glory being unable to afford very expensive equipment, he invented dollies made even from wheelchairs for paraplegics and modified by himself for the purpose of supporting a moving camera. And what about the incredible lenses designed by him and made by Zeiss, with which he filmed the night scenes of the evenings at the gaming tables in Barry Lyndon by candlelight alone, and which earned him another Oscar for photography? With his strong Scorpio-Pluto values, he did not like to reveal himself, and remained as hermetic and mysterious as possible. When, shortly before he died, he was completing his masterpiece of masterpieces, that unforgettable Eyes Wide Shut, someone told him that a critic thought they had understood what the film meant. He commented roughly, "Too bad. If it were true, it would mean I had failed." Indeed, the film in question is quite hermetic, but probably not that incomprehensible. I once spoke about it with an important sociologist and psychologist who gave me his version, which I find more than possible. According to the university professor from Padua, Kubrick wanted to tell us about betrayals seen from Planet Man and Planet Woman, as in the novel Dream Story by the Viennese writer Arthur Schnitzler, from which the film takes its cue. For the woman, the enchanting Nicole Kidman, betrayal is something almost normal, and we see that she dreams of a night of love with an aging but fascinating officer, with whom indeed, if there had been time, she could have consummated adultery. For male psychology, however, conditioned by a greater control of the ego over feelings, the matter is more arduous and requires the paroxysm of certain circumstances for it to happen. Paroxysmal circumstances described precisely in some cult scenes of the macabre Masonic sexual party in the villa outside the city. But let's return to our character and his truly paranormal genius, due, in my opinion, to the tight trine of Uranus in the house of work, to the Sun and the tight Pluto-Mercury conjunction dominant at the medium Quayle. His was indeed genius in almost pure state, starting from the incredible ideas he had when he wrote the screenplay, together with Arthur C. Clarke for 2001, A Space Odyssey. In my opinion, we must reflect on this now immortal and, again in my opinion, unsurpassable film in its genre. Some scenes describe the genius in question, starting with the one in which the protagonist is arriving at the lunar base by means of a shuttle. The pen, dropped by the inspector, who has meanwhile fallen asleep, floats in space around his seat, and the hostess, who advances by means of special shoes that keep her to the floor, lovingly places it in the passenger's pocket. The monitors of the spaceships, shuttles, and all the space vehicles in the film are, in my view, the product of a truly special intelligence. Even in current science fiction films, we see huge monitors and hundreds of buttons and tachometers, altimeters, and 1,000 other things. In the shuttle that leads the two unfortunate astronauts on the mission to repair an antenna outside the spaceship, instead, we admire a very small monitor, about 9 inches or so, and an equally small joystick, by means of which, as is obvious to expect for a vehicle of the future, it is possible not only to view all the parameters necessary for navigation, but also to obtain every desired command. Finally, the monitor with which the astronaut watches television news from Earth on the spaceship, while eating a very thin metal blade on which the images appear. No one has ever gone that far, yet our monitors are about to become exactly this. With his Leo-Scorpio values, compare my book The Foundations of Medical Astrology, Armenia publisher, with Uranus in the 6th, and with Mars in the 8th, Stanley Kubrick left us early due to cardiovascular problems, decidedly prematurely, and this certainly deprived us of new, incredible masterpieces. Ciro Discepolo from the book The Interpretation of the Natal Chart, Armenia publisher, Milan 2007, 340 pages.